Hello, everybody. This is Ashlyn Quigley, the TA for LIS 2005, giving a guest lecture on metadata for the week beginning with March 14th, 2016. I apologize if my voice ever cracks. I am getting over a cold that unfortunately I got the minute that spring break started, but if you bear with me, I think we will enjoy this lecture together. Okay, so we're going to start today with a very brief examination of MARC to lead into our discussion of metadata more specifically. So you probably remember Elizabeth's lecture about MARC from a few weeks ago and MARC 21, and you probably remember Henriette Avram from that lecture. I just wanted to give a face to match up with that name, and also just to revisit her briefly in connection to the creation of MARC. So she started MARC basically with the Library of Congress MARC pilot project in 1965, and MARC continued to evolve over her lifetime, and she retired in 1992 and died in 2006. But now we're going to move on to the idea of MARC encoding. So we're only going to spend a few minutes with this, and it gets a bit confusing. So I would recommend, if you're interested in learning more, that you look up some of the links I provide, but also be aware that there are other metadata courses at the iSchool, and that if you are interested in encoding and learning more about anything that I cover today, that would be a good place to start as well. So encoding of MARC started with SGML, which is the Standard Generalized Markup Language, and it refers to a set of rules for designing a variety of markup languages that describe the structures of documents. So basically, the markup languages provide what are called document type definitions, or DTDs, and this is the stuff that actually lends itself to or directly correlates to bibliographic data. So what happened was SGML was replaced by XML, which you may all be more familiar with. So now MARC records are actually all translated to XML. And I'm going to stop there with my explanation of XML because to understand more, I would recommend actually looking at this link that I've added into the document, but also, again, perhaps taking another course in the future or doing some of your own research into the topic. So if you want to understand the relationship between SGML, HTML, and XML, I would recommend clicking on the link on this slide. Okay. So finally, I'm just going to show the table of contents for MARC 21. And again, some of this is material that Elizabeth went over previously. So for now, we're actually going to leave MARC 21 behind as we consider metadata more in depth. So first of all, I'm going to refresh everyone's memory about what metadata is. It is defined as structured information that describes, explains, locates, or otherwise makes it easier to retrieve, use, or manage an information resource. And I would recommend linking over to the publication that Elizabeth recommended in CourseWeb, and I've linked again to it here, and it's a document that thoroughly describes how to understand metadata, basically. And it is a 20-page document, but it really does have the essential information that you probably want moving forward. Again, as you've probably heard, metadata is defined as data about data. If you think literally about the word metadata, that is exactly what it's referring to. So if we think about metadata in terms of the library catalog, a library catalog holds data about an item. So that would be, for example, the title, author, or location, but does not actually contain the item itself. So if you think about the actual digital catalog for a library, when you access an item that you're looking for, you often will just get the call number and obviously all the metadata about the item that is available, but the physical book will obviously not magically pop out of the computer, although there often are links to ebooks, which would be the item itself. And if you want to do some more reading about metadata and the web, I've inserted a link here to an article called Metadata in the Web by Tony Gill, which is another helpful resource. So as you'll see throughout this lecture, there are a lot of ways to learn more about metadata, in addition to potentially taking the course offered this summer at the iSchool. So, why is metadata important? It is essential to several parts of the library catalog, as you would imagine. It enables better discovery because it essentially allows users to refine their search, and also it basically allows for tagging of items in the sense that you're probably used to from social media as well. So it allows for greater discovery. It also allows for better organization of material because metadata provides the sort of categorization or classification that is so important to organizing material in a library catalog. It also facilitates interoperability, which I'll talk about more in a minute, and legacy resource integration, which basically means that the resource is easier to integrate into new systems, and also it's much easier to archive for those of you who are interested in archiving. So all of this in the left column comprises what is called value-added information. So in sum, it is information that adds value because it permits easier arrangement, description, and the tracking and otherwise enhancing of access to information resources and relevant physical and virtual collections. So it does something that's absolutely essential to this field, which is providing better access. And in other words, it promotes retrieval of information, which is, again, essential to our field. Okay, so to get a little bit more in depth in looking into the functions of metadata, although arguably I think we've already established that it's pretty essential. So metadata enables the identification of information resources in a digital realm, or facilitates that. So descriptive and administrative metadata can be used for validation purposes, which is obviously incredibly important on the web or in any digital realm. And descriptive and technical metadata can provide description for the physical characteristics and requirements for future use. So both of these elements facilitate not only the current use of an information resource and provide for better security, but also just better retrieval, but also keeps in mind that, again, we want this information resource to be able to be integrated or migrated into whatever future systems that it needs to be integrated into. So what are the alternatives to MARC? So many of you have probably heard of Dublin Core, if not actually used it on your own in your jobs or perhaps your internships. There's also the Metadata Object Description Standards, our MODS, and then the Bibliographic Framework Initiative, our BibFrame. And we're going to spend most of our time today with Dublin Core, just because we don't have a lot of time. And again, I would recommend going out and researching the mods and BibFrame more if you're interested in them, or else, again, taking a different class on metadata. So Dublin Core initiated with the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, which met in 1995 in Dublin, Ohio, not in Dublin, Ireland, I will point out. which is a little bit northwest of Columbus, Ohio. So the goal of this particular meeting, and it continues to be the goal of Dublin Core, was to find something that was simple, but that was also functional. And they're also concerned about semantic interoperability, international consensus, and extensibility. So they basically wanted something that was universally understood, but that could also be flexible. So Dublin Core represented an option that was cheap and easy to create and maintain. It originally had just 13 elements, although it eventually expanded to have 15 elements, and these are called the Dublin Core Metadata Element Set, or the DCMES. And the great thing about the Dublin Core elements is that although there are 15, all 15 elements are optional, and they're all repeatable. So, as I mentioned in the previous slide, Dublin Core was intentionally built to be flexible and simple. And I think that that's represented in the elements. According to the Dublin Core Abstract Model, or DCAM, every resource has to have one or more property value pairs, which essentially means there needs to be one property or descriptive element and one value. So any resource that you want to have retrieved, logically enough, will need to have at least one of these pairs, because you want to have the descriptive element, such as creator, title, and date, and the value that correlates to that. So the creator, for example, might be Pablo Picasso for a painting. So the property of that would be creator, and the value would be Pablo Picasso. So to show you an example of this at work, this is a piece of art without metadata, or at least visible metadata. So this is the metadata visualized separately, and I show you that the property in this case would be everything in the left column, so creator, title, work type, date, material, etc. And the value for each of these items would be in the right column. So for example, Max Ernst is the creator, the title is When Light Spreads, the work type is a drawing, and the date is Paris, 1925. And this metadata, I will note, is displayed according to the conventions of Artstor in particular. Artstor is an incredible resource if you're interested in high quality art images, and this is their particular way of displaying their metadata. So this is not necessarily the convention or sort of the display that you might be used to seeing if you're more familiar with a library catalog. But I thought it was a helpful example of how metadata is displayed. So the 15 elements of Dublin Core comprise the following. So there's the contributor, or the entity responsible for making contributions to the resource, which may be a person, organization, or a service. Coverage would be the spatial or temporal topic of the resource, the spatial applicability of the resource, or the jurisdiction under which the resource is relevant. In other words, the content. So it might be the named place or location specified by geographic coordinates, the named period, date, or date range, and it could be something that you're referring to through the thesaurus of geographic names, which I'll actually show a brief demo of right here, because it's something that I've had to use in my cataloging experience over at the Image Library at Frick Fine Arts. So let's go through this together. First, you go to the Getty Thesaurus website, which is www.getty.edu/research/ slash tool slash vocabulary slash TGN forward slash. Or if you want to save time, I would just Google TGN Getty. So once you arrive at the site, you'll see that there are some search boxes sort of front and center in the middle of the site. So for the purposes of this class, I'm just going to look up Pittsburgh. So I type in Pittsburgh to the find name or ID, and I click search. So I find that there are quite a few results under Pittsburgh. There are 22. So first I kind of have to scroll through the different options and determine which one is the actual one that I want to find. So within the conventions of TGN, a city is actually referred to as an inhabited place, so I know right away that I want to look for an inhabited place. So no, I'm not looking for an airport or a cave or a reservoir, but I'm just sticking to inhabited place. Next thing I'll do is I'll look for a Pittsburgh that's in Pennsylvania rather than Kansas or Indiana or Ohio or North Dakota. So once I scroll to the one that's in Pennsylvania, I've really narrowed down the set of results that are relevant. And I know that I'm looking for Pittsburgh rather than East Pittsburgh, so I'm going to click on Pittsburgh. And from there, you'll see that Pittsburgh has its own ID, and the ID is actually 7013927. So if you're cataloging in certain systems such as Collective Access, which I have cataloged in the past, you actually will just use the ID number to identify the geographic place. But if you're using a catalog that asks you for latitude and longitude, which happens as well, TGN provides both of those coordinates as well. Also, if you're interested in the hierarchy behind Pittsburgh, you can see that it's in the county of Allegheny in the state of Pennsylvania, the nation of US, the continent of North and Central America, and the facet, which is the world. So you can sort of see the hierarchy of a particular place, which can be useful if you're trying to figure out if you're actually looking at the right place, or if for some reason you have to go over and look at all of Allegheny County and look at all the inhabited places, for example, in Allegheny County. So TGN is a really useful resource. I have it bookmarked on my own computer, so I highly recommend it. Okay, so now we'll get back to the PowerPoint. So TGN was within, again, the element that is referred to as coverage, which thankfully is a repeatable element because you may want to put in multiple items under this heading. So again, it can refer to the name, place, or location, but it can also name a period, a date, or a date range. And again, for the conventions of the particular cataloging system you might be working in, I would refer to your supervisor, the librarian, or really whatever resource you're directed towards. So the creator is the entity primarily responsible for making the resource, the persons, families, corporate bodies, and services. So for example, in the piece of art that I showed earlier, the creator is Max Ernst. A date may refer to a point or period of time associated with an event in the life cycle of the resource. And I link out to ISO 8601 here, which gives the date and time format accepted by ISO 8601. Although, again, as I just said, the conventions vary by library or archive or museum, so you probably want to refer to the librarian or supervisor in charge of your particular project, as date conventions can change from person to person. So a description is an account of the resource. The format is the file format, as the name suggests. The physical medium are the dimensions of the resource. So, for example, you might use the internet media type as a way of determining what type your particular resource is. So, in the case of the piece that I showed earlier, the format type would be drawing. But if you're talking about a digital catalog for that drawing, it may also be a JPEG or a TIFF or a RAW file. So you want to constantly make sure that you're actually referring to the resource. But yeah, if you go to the internet media types that I've linked out to, you can see that there are lots of different content types that you may be working with. And again, as I keep saying, I would refer to the conventions of your particular institution and how they generally are naming things, hopefully according to a standard. Then you can add an identifier, which you're probably mostly familiar with, ISBNs or UPCs, ISSNs. So basically, these are unambiguous references to the resource within a given content. Within a given context. So the tricky thing about identifiers is that, as you all know, URLs have a tendency to change over time. So I wouldn't necessarily always consider them to be the most stable. So if you have other options for unambiguously referencing a resource, that would also be helpful. If you're looking for, you want to state the language of a resource, I've given the example of ISO 639.2, which provides codes for the representation of names of languages. So you can see that the code that you would use is in the far left corner. If you're for some reason using ISO code 639-1, you can see the naming conventions in that column. And then you can see the English and the French and German names of the language that the code correlates to. So for example, if the particular resource is in French, you would scroll down to French, which you can see is FRE or FRA and FR according to the second convention, and it's called French. Okay, so, going back to the PowerPoint, we can see that the next element would be publisher, which refers to an entity responsible for making the resource available. Relation would be a related resource, and rights refers to information about the rights held in and over the resource. And again, just to reiterate at this point, not all of these elements are necessarily used for any particular resource. They are repeatable. Again, the most important thing is that at least one of these pair to value, property to value relationships exist. And also, depending on the system you're using, they may not appear in this order. So a source is a related resource from which the described resource is derived. A subject is the topic of the resource. The title is the name given to the resource, and the type is the nature or genre of a given resource. So as you can see even from this slide, title in this list of elements is actually given towards the end of the list, but would often appear first. So you can see that I've given a couple of examples of how you can determine the type or genre of a given resource. One is the DCMI type vocabulary, and if you click on that, it'll take you to the dublincore.org website, which I recommend in general, and you can see that the type vocabulary is given below. So a type could be a collection, it could be a data set, it could be an image, it could be a moving image, etc. So the type or genre that I've mostly worked with is the Art and Architecture Thesaurus from the Getty. So I've also linked over to that in case you're curious. So if you click over to the art and architecture thesaurus, similar to TGN, because it is a Getty system, you just will put in the term or ID for what you're looking for. So if you're looking for a particular type of, for example, drawing, you can see that there are lots of different types of drawings. Excuse me, sorry, my voice is kind of getting a bit worse. But yeah, you can see there's a lot of different types of drawings, including animated cartoons, assembly drawings, blot drawings, etc. So there are 55 properties in the Dublin Core, and these are this is the current set of 55 properties. Again, you can look into this more in depth if you'd like by exploring the Dublin Core website, or also by taking the metadata course in the summer. So RDA to DC. So the RDA element set is compatible with ISBD, Mark 21, and Dublin Core. But the problem is that there are actually no best practices. So what I've provided here is a map for how the RDA element groupings map onto corresponding DC elements. And if you do more with metadata, you will be doing more of this sort of mapping onto different elements in the future. So you can see, for example, that in RDA, what is called the statement of responsibility corresponds to the creator and contributor for Dublin Core. And the edition statement refers to the designation of the edition, or the designation of a named revision of an edition, which would relate to the relation element in Dublin Core, and so on. So if you want to look more into this, I would recommend either reading more on the Dublin Core website or the RDA website, and then if you want more, taking the course. So the example they gave in the textbook as an example of Dublin Core is Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, which I highly recommend. It is a great book. And as you can see in the figure, this is the Dublin Core metadata for the book in a Dublin Core template. So as I've mentioned before, usually wouldn't come across a resource that actually has its metadata displayed like this, because I'm more used to collective access or using Omeka. But for this example, this is a Dublin Core template. So you can see that the element, the properties are listed on the left column, and then the value pair are listed in the right column. So the title is Fun Home. The refinement of the title is a family tragicomic. The creator is Alison Bechdel, 1960. And then the subject is provided according to LCSH, LCC, and DDC. The description is provided, which is kind of like an abstract. If there's a publisher description, that might be what goes in here. It kind of depends on what the standard is where you're working. The description can be, again, all elements are repeatable, as you can see. So there's a second description, which provides the table of contents. The publisher is Houghton Mifflin. The date of copyright is provided, 2006. The type, according to DCMI, is provided, which is a still image, text, graphic novels, comic books. So you can see that a book like this is a little bit more complex than maybe a textbook or a fiction book that does not contain any images. The format, so it provides the extent, which is 232 pages. The medium is the volume. In archiving in particular, sometimes the extent is given in number of boxes, because an archive or a collection can comprise a number of boxes. So that's where that would fit in. An identifier, in this case, they provide the ISBN number and the LCCN. And then the language is English. That looks like it's in accordance with the ISO standard that we looked at earlier. And then the coverage is the United States.